Maria Santos had been delivering food for 3 years, weaving through the busy streets of downtown on her bright yellow scooter. At 28, she had become an expert at navigating traffic, reading the patterns of cars and pedestrians like a well-rehearsed dance. The evening rush hour was her busiest time, when office workers craved hot meals and generous tips flowed like water. That Tuesday evening started like any other. Her phone buzzed with orders from the popular Thai restaurant on 5th Street. 3 deliveries lined up perfectly along her usual route. She secured the insulated bags to her scooter, double-checking that the containers wouldn't spill during the journey ahead. The first stop went smoothly. Mrs. Chen, a regular customer, even added an extra $5 to her tip through the app. The second delivery took her across town to a new apartment complex where a young couple eagerly waited for their pad thai and spring rolls. Everything was running perfectly on schedule. Meanwhile, across the city, Jake Morrison was having the worst day of his career. The 34-year-old marketing executive had just lost the biggest client his agency had worked with in 5 years. His boss had called him into the office for what Jake thought would be a congratulatory meeting about closing the deal. Instead, he found himself facing accusations of unprofessionalism and threats about his job security. Jake left the office in a haze of anger and frustration. His hands shook as he pulled on his leather jacket and helmet. The powerful engine of his red Ducati roared to life beneath him, offering the only comfort he could find in that moment. He needed to ride, to feel the wind against his face, to let the speed wash away the humiliation of the day. The streets blurred past him as he accelerated through the downtown area. Traffic lights became mere suggestions as his speedometer climbed higher and higher. Other drivers honked and swerved out of his way, but Jake barely noticed. His mind was consumed with replaying every moment of that disastrous meeting, searching for where everything had gone wrong. Maria was approaching the intersection of Oak Street and 3rd Avenue when she noticed the motorcycle in her peripheral vision. Something about its speed caught her attention immediately. The rider seemed to be moving much faster than the flow of traffic around him, weaving between cars with dangerous precision. She had encountered reckless drivers before and knew to give them plenty of space. But this intersection was particularly tricky during rush hour. Cars were backed up in all directions, and the traffic light had been malfunctioning for weeks, cycling through its phases too quickly for the heavy traffic to clear properly. Jake saw the yellow scooter ahead of him, but misjudged both his speed and the distance between them. He was still thinking about his boss's harsh words, still feeling the sting of potential unemployment. The motorcycle's powerful engine responded instantly to his throttle, but his reflexes were dulled by emotional turmoil. Maria had just cleared the intersection when she heard the roar of the approaching motorcycle. She glanced in her mirror and felt her stomach drop. The red bike was coming straight toward her, and the rider showed no signs of slowing down. She had perhaps 3 seconds to react. Instinctively, she swerved toward the right side of the road, hoping to give the motorcycle room to pass safely. But Jake, seeing her sudden movement, jerked his handlebars in the same direction. The physics of the situation were already set in motion. The impact happened in slow motion and lightning speed simultaneously. Jake's front wheel clipped the back corner of Maria's scooter, sending both vehicles into a chaotic dance of metal and momentum. Maria felt herself lifted from her seat, suspended in air for what seemed like an eternity before gravity reclaimed her. Jake's motorcycle high-sided, launching him over the handlebars. But instead of flying clear of the accident, his leg caught on something, twisting his body in an unnatural direction. The heavy machine followed him down, its 400 pounds of steel and chrome becoming a crushing weight. Maria hit the asphalt hard, her delivery bags exploding in a shower of Thai curry and broken containers. She rolled several times before coming to rest against a parked car, her yellow scooter sliding in the opposite direction with a shower of sparks. But Jake's fate was far worse. The motorcycle had landed directly on top of him, its frame pressed across his torso and legs. The engine, still hot from his high-speed ride, burned through his leather jacket. His helmet had cracked against the pavement and blood was beginning to pool beneath his head. The intersection fell eerily quiet except for the hiss of escaping steam from the damaged vehicles. Car engines idled as drivers sat stunned, trying to process what they had just witnessed. A few brave souls began to emerge from their cars, reaching for their phones to call for help. Maria struggled to her feet, her left arm hanging at an odd angle. Pain shot through her ribs with every breath, but she could move. She could think. She was alive. Her eyes searched the scene until she spotted the red motorcycle and the still form beneath it. Without hesitation, she began limping toward the wreckage. Other bystanders were approaching cautiously, some already on their phones with emergency services. But Maria reached Jake first, and what she saw beneath that motorcycle would haunt her dreams for months to come. Jake was conscious but barely responsive. His eyes darted frantically between Maria's face and the crushing weight of his own machine. He tried to speak but only managed weak gasps. His legs were completely pinned, and a dark stain was spreading across the pavement beneath him. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Maria, even in her shocked state. This man had nearly killed her with his reckless riding, and now she was the closest thing to help he had. Every instinct told her to wait for the paramedics, to keep her distance from the dangerous wreckage. But looking into Jake's terrified eyes, she saw something that transcended blame and anger. She saw a human being who was about to die unless someone acted quickly. The motorcycle was too heavy for her to lift alone, but she couldn't just stand there and watch him fade away beneath its crushing weight. The sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, but Maria knew they might not arrive in time. She looked around at the gathering crowd of onlookers, most of them paralyzed by the severity of the accident. Someone had to take charge, and despite her own injuries, that someone was going to be her. Maria knelt beside Jake's trapped form, her nursing school training from years ago flooding back to her mind. She had dropped out in her second year to help support her family, but the basic emergency response procedures remained embedded in her memory. The first rule was always the same: assess the situation before acting. Jake's motorcycle had landed at an angle that created a precarious balance. The main weight was crushing his lower torso and legs, but his chest was still relatively free. She could see he was breathing, though each breath came with visible effort and pain. His face had gone pale, and she recognized the signs of shock setting in. "Can you hear me?" she asked, leaning closer to his face. Blood from her own head wound dripped onto his cracked helmet. "I'm going to get you out of there, but I need you to stay with me." Jake's eyes focused on her with difficulty. He managed a barely audible whisper. "Can't feel my legs." The crowd around them had grown larger, but most people maintained their distance, unsure how to help or afraid of making the situation worse. Maria looked up desperately, searching for someone who might have the strength to help lift the motorcycle. "I need help here," she called out. "This bike is crushing him." A middle-aged man in a business suit stepped forward hesitantly. "I called 911, he said. "They're on their way. Maybe we should wait for the professionals." "He doesn't have time to wait," Maria replied firmly. She could see Jake's condition deteriorating by the minute. His breathing was becoming more shallow and the blood loss was accelerating. "I need at least 3 strong people to help me lift this motorcycle." Another man approached, this one wearing construction work clothes and looking more confident about physical labor. "I'll help," he said simply. "But we need to be careful. If we drop it or shift it wrong, we could make things worse." A woman who had been watching from her car joined them. "I'm a physical therapist," she announced. "I've seen these kinds of injuries before. We need to lift straight up and move the bike completely clear. No dragging or shifting." Maria felt a wave of relief at having medical backup. Together they began organizing the rescue attempt. The construction worker, whose name was Tom, took charge of coordinating the lifting. The physical therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, positioned herself to monitor Jake's vital signs and guide his removal once the weight was lifted. But as they prepared to attempt the lift, Jake's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. His eyes rolled back and his breathing became irregular. Maria could see foam forming at the corners of his mouth, and his skin had taken on a grayish tone that she recognized as a very bad sign. "We need to do this now," Dr. Kim said urgently. "He's going into traumatic shock. If we don't relieve that pressure immediately, we're going to lose him." Tom had managed to recruit 2 other men from the crowd, creating a team of 4 lifters. They positioned themselves around the motorcycle, each finding the best grip they could manage. The bike was heavier than any of them had anticipated, and the angle made it even more difficult to get proper leverage. "On my count," Tom instructed. 1, 2, 3, lift." The 4 men strained against the weight of the machine, but it barely budged. The motorcycle was not just heavy. It was also wedged against the curb at an angle that made lifting nearly impossible with their current positions. Maria watched Jake's face as they attempted the lift. His eyes had closed completely now, and she couldn't detect any movement of his chest. Panic began to set in as she realized they were watching him die. "It's not working," she said. "We need a different approach." Dr. Kim was checking Jake's pulse at his wrist and neck. "Pulse is very weak and getting weaker," she reported grimly. "We have maybe 2 or 3 minutes before his body shuts down completely." The sound of sirens was getting closer, but not close enough. Traffic was heavy in all directions, and emergency vehicles were having difficulty reaching the scene. Maria could see flashing lights several blocks away, but they seemed to be moving at a crawl through the congested streets. Tom was studying the motorcycle from different angles, looking for a better approach. "If we can get something to use as a lever," he said, "maybe we can lift one end high enough to pull him out." "There's a construction site 2 blocks down," called out someone from the crowd. "They might have a jack or a crowbar." "No time," Maria said flatly. She was watching Jake's face, and the subtle changes she saw there terrified her. "We have to work with what we have right here, right now." That's when she noticed something that changed everything. The motorcycle's position, while crushing Jake's lower body, had created a small gap near his head and shoulders. If they could somehow drag him out from the top end instead of trying to lift the entire motorcycle, they might be able to free him. "Look," she said, pointing to the gap. "We don't need to lift the whole bike. We need to pull him out this way." Dr. Kim examined the space Maria had identified. "It's risky," she said. "If he has spinal injuries, moving him like that could cause permanent paralysis or worse." "He's going to die if we don't move him," Maria replied. "And he's probably going to die if we do. But at least this way we're giving him a chance." The physical therapist nodded grimly. She understood the harsh mathematics of emergency medicine. Sometimes the choice wasn't between good options and bad options, but between bad options and worse options. They repositioned themselves around Jake's still form. Tom and another man would lift the motorcycle just enough to reduce the pressure slightly. Maria and Dr. Kim would guide Jake's upper body as they attempted to slide him free from the crushing weight. "Remember," Dr. Kim cautioned, "keep his head and neck as stable as possible. If his spine is damaged, any twisting motion could sever his spinal cord completely." Maria nodded, her hands already positioned behind Jake's head. She could feel the warmth of his blood seeping through her fingers, and his breathing had become so shallow that she had to watch closely to detect it at all. "Ready?" Tom asked. Maria looked down at Jake's face one more time. Somewhere beneath that pale, unconscious features was a person with family, friends, dreams, and regrets. A person who had made a terrible mistake that had nearly killed her, but who deserved every chance at survival she could give him. "Ready," she said. The rescue attempt began with Tom and his helper straining to lift even a few inches of the motorcycle's weight. The machine groaned and shifted slightly, just enough to reduce some of the crushing pressure on Jake's torso. Maria and Dr. Kim began the delicate process of sliding Jake's limp form toward the gap they had identified. Every movement had to be slow and controlled, but they also knew that time was running out fast. Jake's body moved a few inches, then a few more. But halfway through the extraction, something went wrong. The motorcycle slipped from Tom's grip just as they had Jake halfway free. The heavy machine settled back down with a sickening thud, trapping Jake's legs even more securely than before. Dr. Kim immediately felt for his pulse again and found it barely detectable. "We're losing him," she announced to the group. "His blood pressure is dropping too fast." Maria felt a surge of frustration and desperation that nearly overwhelmed her. They had been so close to freeing him, and now the situation was worse than when they started. Jake's breathing had become even more labored, and she could see fresh blood seeping from beneath the motorcycle. The emergency sirens were definitely getting closer, but she estimated they still had at least 3 or 4 minutes before help arrived. Looking at Jake's deteriorating condition, she wasn't sure he had 3 or 4 more minutes left in him. "We need to try again," she said firmly. "But this time we need more people and a better plan." Tom was breathing heavily from the exertion of trying to lift the motorcycle. "That bike has to weigh at least 400 pounds, he said. "And the angle makes it feel like twice that much." Dr. Kim was using her phone's flashlight to examine Jake more closely. What she saw made her expression grow even more grave. "There's significant internal bleeding," she reported quietly to Maria. "I can see the signs of organ damage. Even if we get him free right now, his chances are not good." Despite the grim prognosis, Maria refused to give up. She looked out at the crowd of bystanders and began making direct eye contact with the strongest-looking individuals. "You," she said, pointing to a young man in athletic wear. "And you," she continued, indicating a woman who appeared to be a bodybuilder or fitness enthusiast. "I need every person here who can lift to help us save this man's life." The direct approach worked. Within moments, she had assembled a team of 8 volunteers willing to attempt the lift. Dr. Kim organized them into positions around the motorcycle while Maria took charge of Jake's extraction once the weight was lifted. But before they could make their second attempt, Jake's eyes suddenly fluttered open. He looked directly at Maria with an expression of complete clarity that hadn't been there before. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the traffic noise. "I'm so sorry for hitting you." Maria felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Here was a man who might be dying because of his own reckless actions, and his first conscious words were an apology to the person he had nearly killed. "Don't talk," she told him gently. "Save your strength. We're going to get you out of there." Jake's eyes remained fixed on her face. "Are you hurt badly?" he asked. The question caught Maria off guard. Her own injuries had been completely forgotten in the urgency of trying to save Jake's life. Her left arm was definitely broken. She had several cracked ribs and blood was still trickling from a head wound. But compared to what Jake was facing, her injuries seemed minor. "I'm fine," she lied. "Don't worry about me." Dr. Kim leaned down closer to Jake. "Can you feel anything in your legs?" she asked. Jake tried to focus on the sensation, but his face quickly showed the answer. "No," he admitted. "I can't feel anything below my waist." The physical therapist exchanged a meaningful glance with Maria. Spinal cord damage was now almost certain, but they still had to get him free from the crushing weight of the motorcycle before they could assess the full extent of his injuries. "Listen to me," Maria said, taking Jake's hand in her uninjured right hand. "We're going to lift this motorcycle off you. When we do, you might feel a lot of pain as the blood starts flowing back to your legs. That's actually a good sign, okay?" Jake nodded weakly, but Maria could see that he understood the implications of not being able to feel his legs. The fear in his eyes was heartbreaking, but there was also something else there, a kind of resigned acceptance that touched her deeply. The team of 8 volunteers positioned themselves around the motorcycle. Tom had found a piece of broken concrete that could serve as a fulcrum, potentially making the lift more manageable. Dr. Kim had torn strips from her blouse to use as makeshift bandages for the worst of Jake's visible injuries. On the count of 3, Tom announced, "Everyone lifts together straight up. Hold it for at least 30 seconds so we can get him clear." Maria positioned herself at Jake's head, ready to guide his extraction. She had folded her jacket into a makeshift neck brace, knowing that spinal stabilization was critical during the move. 1, Tom counted. Maria felt Jake squeeze her hand weakly. 2. She could hear the emergency vehicles getting closer. The cavalry was coming, but would they arrive in time? 3. 8 people strained against the weight of the motorcycle, and this time it lifted. Not easily and not by much, but enough to create the gap Maria needed. She began sliding Jake's upper body toward freedom, moving as quickly as she dared while trying to keep his head and neck aligned. "Keep lifting," she called to the team. She could see the strain on their faces, could hear their labored breathing as they fought against gravity and the awkward angle of the lift. Jake's torso cleared the motorcycle, then his waist, but when his legs came free, the sight made several of the bystanders gasp in horror. His right leg was twisted at an impossible angle, and his left leg was bleeding heavily from what appeared to be a compound fracture. "Don't look," Maria told Jake quickly, but she could see in his eyes that he had already understood. The damage to his legs was severe, possibly irreparable. Dr. Kim immediately began applying pressure to the worst of the bleeding wounds. "We need clean cloth," she called out. "Anything we can use for bandages and pressure points." Several people began tearing clothing and handing over jackets and shirts. Maria found herself coordinating a field hospital with whatever materials they could gather from the crowd and the vehicles around them. The first police car arrived just as they were stabilizing Jake's most serious injuries. The officer immediately called for additional medical support and began clearing the area of unnecessary bystanders. But Maria refused to leave Jake's side. "I'm staying with him until the paramedics get here," she said firmly, when the officer suggested she should seek medical attention for her own injuries. Jake's Eyes were closed again, but his breathing seemed slightly more stable now that the crushing weight had been removed. Dr. Kim was monitoring his pulse and reported that it was weak but steady. You saved his life, the physical therapist told Maria quietly. If you hadn't organized that lift when you did, he wouldn't have made it. Maria looked down at Jake's pale face and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Anger at his reckless driving that had nearly killed them both, compassion for the suffering he was enduring, and a strange sense of connection forged in the crucible of this life-and-death struggle. The ambulance finally arrived, and the paramedics took over with professional efficiency. They had advanced equipment for spinal stabilization, proper bandages, and medications that could help manage Jake's pain and shock. As they loaded Jake onto the stretcher, he opened his eyes one more time and found Maria's face in the crowd. "Thank you," he mouthed silently. Maria nodded, not trusting her voice to respond. She watched the ambulance drive away with its lights flashing and sirens wailing, carrying Jake toward an uncertain future that she had helped make possible. 3 hours later, Maria sat in the emergency room of St. Mary's Hospital, her left arm now properly set in a cast and her head wound, cleaned, and bandaged. The doctors had confirmed what she already knew: several cracked ribs, a broken radius bone, and a mild concussion. She would be sore for weeks, but she would recover completely. What she couldn't stop thinking about was Jake Morrison, whose full name she had learned from the police report. He was somewhere in this same hospital, fighting for his life and surgery. The paramedics had told her that his condition was critical, and the damage to his spinal cord was extensive. Dr. Patricia Williams, the emergency room physician who had treated Maria, sat down beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "You should go home and rest," she said gently. "There's nothing more you can do here tonight." "I need to know if he's going to be okay," Maria replied. "I need to know that what we did back there mattered." Dr. Williams had heard the story from the police and paramedics who brought both patients in. She knew that Maria had organized the rescue effort that likely saved Jake's life, despite being injured herself in the same accident. "The orthopedic surgeons are still working on his legs," she said, "and the neurosurgeons are trying to stabilize his spinal cord. It's going to be a long night for him." Maria sipped the coffee and winced as the movement aggravated her ribs. The reality of her own injuries was starting to set in as the adrenaline wore off. Every breath hurt, her head was pounding, and the broken arm throbbed constantly despite the pain medication. "Did the police tell you what caused the accident?" she asked. Dr. Williams nodded. "Witnesses said he was speeding, weaving through traffic. They estimated he was going at least 50 miles per hour in a 35 zone. She paused. "They also said that if you hadn't swerved when you did, the collision would have been head-on. You probably saved both your lives with that quick reaction." The thought of how much worse the accident could have been sent a chill through Maria. If Jake had hit her scooter head-on at that speed, they would both likely be dead instead of sitting in a hospital waiting room. A man in his 60s approached them hesitantly. He was well-dressed but looked haggard, as if he had been crying. "Excuse me," he said to Maria. "Are you the woman who helped my son after the accident?" Maria looked up in surprise. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same jawline, the same green eyes, though these were red-rimmed with worry and grief. "I'm Robert Morrison," he continued, "Jake's father. The police told me what you did, how you organized the rescue when he was trapped under his motorcycle." His voice broke slightly. "They said you might have saved his life." Maria struggled to find the right words. "How do you respond to gratitude from the father of the man who nearly killed you? How do you explain the complex emotions that had driven her to help instead of simply waiting for professional emergency responders?" "Anyone would have done the same thing," she said finally. Robert Morrison shook his head firmly. "No, they wouldn't have. The police told me there were dozens of people standing around, but you were the one who took charge. You were the one who organized the lift that got him free." He paused, struggling with emotion. "And you did this even though he was the one who caused the accident." Maria felt Dr. Williams watching the exchange with interest. The physician had seen many accident victims over the years, but rarely had she witnessed such an unusual dynamic between victim and perpetrator. "How is he doing?" Maria asked. "Is he going to be okay?" Robert's expression grew grave. "The doctors say the next 24 hours will be critical. He lost a lot of blood, and there's significant damage to his spinal cord. They don't know yet if he'll ever walk again." He sat down heavily in the chair across from Maria. But he's alive. And the doctors say that's because of the quick action people took at the scene. The three of them sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. The emergency room continued its usual chaos around them. Ambulances arriving, families waiting for news, medical staff rushing between patient rooms. "I don't understand why you helped him," Robert said eventually, "after what he did to you." Maria had been asking herself the same question for hours. Why had she risked further injury to herself to save the man who had nearly killed her? Why had she organized strangers into a rescue team instead of simply waiting for the paramedics? "I've been thinking about that," she said slowly. "And I think it's because in that moment, when I saw him trapped under his motorcycle, he wasn't the reckless driver who hit me. He was just a person who was about to die if someone didn't help him." Dr. Williams nodded approvingly. "That's a remarkably mature perspective," she said. "Many people would have been too angry or traumatized to think clearly in that situation." "I was angry," Maria admitted. "I'm still angry. What your son did was stupid and dangerous, and it could have killed both of us." She looked directly at Robert. "But being angry at someone doesn't mean you let them die when you can prevent it." Robert Morrison began to cry quietly. "He's been having problems at work," he said. His job, his relationship, everything seemed to be falling apart. "I think he was just lost." He wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it might explain why he was driving so recklessly. Dr. Williams excused herself to check on other patients, leaving Maria alone with Jake's father. She found herself curious about the man who had nearly ended her life. What kind of person was he when he wasn't behind the wheel of a motorcycle, consumed by rage and poor judgment? "Tell me about him," she said. "What's he like when he's not having the worst day of his life?" Robert's face brightened slightly. "Jake's always been impulsive," he admitted. "But he's also generous and caring. He volunteers at an animal shelter on weekends. He visits his grandmother every Sunday. When his sister was going through her divorce, he let her and her kids live with him for 6 months." Maria listened to these details with mixed feelings. It was easier to be angry at a faceless, reckless driver than at a complex human being who rescued animals and took care of his family. "He made a terrible mistake today," Robert continued. "The worst mistake of his life. But he's not a bad person." Before Maria could respond, Dr. Williams returned with a neurosurgeon in scrubs. The surgeon looked exhausted, and his expression was serious. "Mr. Morrison," the surgeon addressed Jake's father. "I'm Dr. Chen. I've been operating on your son." Robert stood up quickly, his face pale with anticipation. "How is he?" "He's stable for now," Dr. Chen said. "We were able to repair most of the damage to his internal organs, and we've stopped the internal bleeding. But there is extensive damage to his spinal cord at the L2 and L3 vertebrae." "What does that mean?" Robert asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. "It means there's a very high probability that he will have permanent paralysis from the waist down," Dr. Chen said gently. "We won't know for certain until the swelling goes down, but the damage is quite severe." Maria felt her stomach drop. She had helped save Jake's life, but the life she had saved would be forever changed. He would live, but he would spend the rest of his days in a wheelchair, dealing with the consequences of those few seconds of reckless driving. Robert sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the news. "Can I see him?" he asked quietly. "He's in intensive care recovery now," Dr. Chen replied. "You can see him briefly, but he's still heavily sedated." As Robert prepared to leave with the surgeon, he turned back to Maria one more time. "I know this is a lot to ask," he said, "but when Jake wakes up and starts to understand what his life is going to be like now, I think it might help him to meet you again, to understand that you don't hate him for what happened." Maria wasn't sure she was ready for that conversation, but she found herself nodding anyway. "When he's feeling better," she agreed. "When he's ready." After they left, Maria sat alone in the waiting room, processing everything that had happened. In the span of a few hours, her life had intersected with Jake Morrison's in the most dramatic way possible. She had nearly been killed by his recklessness, then had saved his life despite her own injuries. Now he would live, but as a paraplegic, facing a future completely different from anything he had ever imagined, and somehow she had become a part of his story, just as he had become a part of hers. 2 weeks after the accident, Maria returned to work despite her doctor's recommendation to take more time off. The cast on her left arm made delivering food challenging, but she needed the income. Her insurance would cover the medical bills, but it wouldn't pay her rent or buy groceries while she recovered. Her yellow scooter had been totaled in the crash, and she was now driving a borrowed motorcycle from her friend Carlos. Every time she approached an intersection, she found herself gripping the handlebars tighter and checking her mirrors obsessively. The confidence she had built up over 3 years of city riding had been shattered in those few seconds of impact. She hadn't heard anything about Jake Morrison since that night in the hospital, and she tried not to think about him as she went about her daily routine. But reminders were everywhere. Every motorcycle she saw on the road, every accident scene she passed, every news story about reckless driving brought back the memory of his pale face beneath the crushing weight of his own machine. The physical therapy for her arm was progressing well, but the emotional healing was more complicated. She found herself alternating between anger and compassion, sometimes within the same hour. One moment she would be furious about the injuries and trauma he had caused her, and the next she would find herself wondering how he was coping with his new reality. Her family had mixed reactions to her role in Jake's rescue. Her mother was proud of her daughter's compassion but worried about the risks Maria had taken. Her brother Carlos, who had lent her the replacement motorcycle, was more blunt in his assessment. "You should have let him suffer under that bike," he said during one of their weekly dinners. "Maybe it would have taught him a lesson about driving like a maniac." "He's already learned that lesson," Maria replied quietly. "Probably better than anyone ever could." Her sister Elena had a different perspective. As a social worker, she dealt with the aftermath of trauma and poor decisions on a daily basis. "What you did was remarkable," she told Maria. "You saw past your own pain and anger to recognize another human being in crisis. That takes real strength." But Maria wasn't feeling particularly strong these days. The nightmares were frequent. Sometimes she dreamed about the accident happening differently, with both of them dying in the collision. Sometimes she dreamed about Jake being trapped forever beneath his motorcycle, calling for help that never came. 3 weeks after the accident, she received an unexpected phone call at work. She was taking a break between deliveries when her phone rang with an unknown number. "Hello, is this Maria Santos?" The voice was unfamiliar but sounded official. "Yes, this is Maria. My name is Detective Rodriguez with the Metro Police Department. I've been investigating the motorcycle accident you were involved in last month. I was wondering if you might have some time to discuss the incident with me." Maria felt her stomach tighten. She had already given a statement to the police at the scene and assumed the matter was closed. "Is there a problem with my statement?" "No, nothing like that," Detective Rodriguez assured her. "But there have been some developments in the case that I'd like to discuss with you. Mr. Morrison has been asking to speak with you, and his attorney has made some requests that might be relevant to your situation." "What kind of requests?" Maria asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Mr. Morrison wants to meet with you in person to apologize and discuss compensation for your injuries. His insurance company is prepared to offer a settlement that goes well beyond your medical expenses." Detective Rodriguez paused. "But there's also the matter of potential criminal charges. The district attorney is considering filing charges of reckless endangerment and vehicular assault." Maria was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. She hadn't thought much about the legal implications of the accident, focusing instead on her physical recovery and getting back to work. "Do I have to meet with him?" she asked. "No, you don't have to do anything," the detective replied. "But your input could be valuable in determining how the case proceeds. If you're willing to meet with him, it should be in a controlled environment with legal representation present." After hanging up, Maria sat in her parked motorcycle for several minutes, trying to decide how she felt about potentially seeing Jake Morrison again. Part of her was curious about his recovery and how he was adapting to his new circumstances. But another part of her wasn't ready to face the man whose recklessness had changed both their lives forever. She called her sister Elena that evening to discuss the situation. Elena listened carefully as Maria explained the detective's call and the various options she was facing. "What does your gut tell you?" Elena asked. "When you think about seeing him again, what's your first instinct?" "I'm scared," Maria admitted. Not of him physically, but scared of what that conversation might bring up. "I've been trying to move on, to get back to normal. Seeing him again might undo all the progress I've made. Or it might give you the closure you need to really move forward," Elena suggested. Sometimes the things we avoid are the things we most need to confront. That night, Maria lay in bed thinking about Jake Morrison's current situation. According to what his father had told her, he was facing life as a paraplegic. His legs would never work again. His independence would be severely limited, and he would need to rebuild his entire sense of identity around his new physical limitations. She tried to imagine what that would feel like, to wake up every morning, knowing that a few seconds of poor judgment had cost you the use of your legs forever. The guilt and regret must be overwhelming, especially knowing that he had also seriously injured an innocent person in the process. The next morning, Maria called Detective Rodriguez back and agreed to meet with Jake Morrison. She requested that Elena be present as her support person, and that the meeting take place at the police station rather than the hospital or Jake's home. "I think that's wise," the detective agreed. "We'll schedule it for next Thursday afternoon. Mr. Morrison's attorney will be present, but this is primarily an opportunity for him to apologize and for you to ask any questions you might have." The days leading up to the meeting passed slowly. Maria found herself more nervous than she had expected. She changed her mind about going through with it several times, but Elena encouraged her to stick with her decision. "You need to see how he's doing," Elena said. "You need to see that he's taking responsibility for what happened, and you need to hear him acknowledge the impact his actions had on your life." Thursday arrived gray and overcast, matching Maria's mood as she and Elena drove to the police station. Detective Rodriguez met them in the lobby and escorted them to a small conference room where Jake Morrison was already waiting. The change in his appearance was startling. The Jake Morrison she remembered from the accident scene had been a healthy, athletic man in his 30s. The man sitting across from her now was gaunt and pale, confined to a wheelchair, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who had been dealing with chronic pain and depression. But his eyes were alert and focused, and when he saw Maria enter the room, she could see a mixture of relief and profound sadness cross his face. "Maria," he said quietly, "thank you for agreeing to see me. I wasn't sure you would." Maria took a seat across from him with Elena beside her for support. Jake's attorney, a middle-aged woman in a business suit, sat quietly nearby with a legal pad. "How are you feeling?" Jake asked. "I mean physically. Are you recovering okay from your injuries?" "I'm fine," Maria replied, though the question struck her as odd. Here was a man who would never walk again asking about her relatively minor injuries. "My arm is healing well and the ribs don't hurt anymore." Jake nodded, looking relieved. "I'm so sorry," he said, and Maria could hear the genuine anguish in his voice. "I'm sorry for hitting you, for injuring you, for putting you through all of this. There's no excuse for how I was driving that day." Maria had prepared herself for this apology, but hearing it delivered with such raw emotion was more powerful than she had expected. She could see that Jake had been carrying the weight of guilt and regret every day since the accident. "I know you were having a bad day," she said carefully. "Your father told me about the problems at work." Jake's expression grew even more pained. "That's not an excuse," he said firmly. "I was angry and I was driving recklessly and I nearly killed both of us because of it. A bad day at work doesn't justify putting innocent people in danger." The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Jake told Maria about his recovery, about learning to navigate life from a wheelchair, about the depression and anger he was working through with counselors and therapists. He also talked about the changes he was making in his life, selling his motorcycle, seeking treatment for his anger management issues, and becoming involved with organizations that promoted motorcycle safety. But what struck Maria most was how often Jake asked about her well-being, her recovery, her ability to return to work. Despite facing his own life-altering challenges, he seemed genuinely concerned about the impact his actions had had on her life. "The police told me what you did," Jake said toward the end of their conversation. "How you organized the people to lift my motorcycle off me. I don't understand why you did that, but I want you to know it means everything to me." Maria had been dreading this part of the conversation. "I don't really understand it either," she admitted. "I was angry at you, but I couldn't just stand there and watch you die." Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Maria could see him struggling with emotion. "I don't deserve that kind of compassion," he said finally, "but I'm grateful for it every day." As the meeting came to an end, Jake's attorney presented Maria with information about the insurance settlement they were offering. The amount was substantial, enough to cover her medical expenses, lost wages, pain, and suffering. and provide a significant financial cushion for her future. But Jake also had a personal request that went beyond the legal and financial aspects of the case. He asked if Maria would be willing to speak with him occasionally during his recovery, to help him understand the full impact of his actions, and to serve as a reminder of why he needed to make better choices going forward. Maria wasn't sure she was ready for that level of ongoing connection, but she agreed to consider it. As she and Elena prepared to leave, Jake called out to her one more time. "Maria," he said, "I want you to know that what happened has changed me completely. I will never drive recklessly again, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I did." Looking at him sitting in that wheelchair, Maria believed him. His transformation seemed genuine, born from real understanding of the consequences of his actions. But she also knew that his journey of redemption was just beginning, and she wasn't sure what role, if any, she wanted to play in it. 6 months after the accident, Maria had established a new routine that felt almost normal. The insurance settlement from Jake Morrison's case had allowed her to buy a reliable used car, eliminating her need to navigate city traffic on 2 wheels. She had also enrolled in night classes at the community college, working toward the nursing degree she had abandoned years earlier to support her family. The physical scars from the accident had healed, but the emotional impact remained complex and evolving. She no longer had nightmares about the crash, but she found herself more cautious in all aspects of her life, checking and rechecking traffic before crossing streets, driving more defensively, being generally more aware of how quickly life could change. Jake Morrison had kept his word about staying in touch, though their communication was limited to occasional emails and text messages. He updated her on his progress in physical therapy, his involvement with motorcycle safety advocacy, and his efforts to rebuild his life around his new limitations. The criminal charges against Jake had been reduced to reckless driving with a suspended sentence, largely due to Maria's testimony about his genuine remorse and commitment to change. The district attorney had been prepared to pursue more serious charges, but Maria's willingness to speak on Jake's behalf had influenced the final decision. Some people in Maria's life thought she had been too forgiving. Carlos, her brother, remained convinced that Jake had gotten off too easily for his actions, but Maria had come to believe that Jake's permanent paralysis was punishment enough for his moment of reckless judgment. Elena, on the other hand, had been impressed by Maria's emotional maturity throughout the entire ordeal. "You managed to separate the person from the action," she told Maria during one of their weekly phone calls. "You held him accountable for what he did, but you didn't let anger consume you in the process." The relationship between Maria and Jake had evolved into something neither of them had expected, not quite friendship, but more than mere acquaintances connected by tragedy. They had both been changed by their shared experience, and they seemed to understand each other in ways that other people in their lives couldn't quite grasp. Jake had become involved with a non-profit organization that provided motorcycle safety training, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the consequences of aggressive riding. He often mentioned in his emails how much Maria's compassion had influenced his decision to turn his experience into something positive. Meanwhile, Maria had discovered that her experience organizing Jake's rescue had awakened interests she hadn't known she possessed. Her nursing classes were going well, and she had particular aptitude for emergency medicine. Several of her instructors had commented on her natural leadership abilities and her calm demeanor under pressure. One evening in late spring, Maria received a call from Jake that was different from their usual brief check-ins. He sounded nervous and uncertain, quite different from the confident tone he had developed in recent months as he adapted to his new life. "Maria, I have something I need to ask you," he said, "and please feel free to say no if it makes you uncomfortable." "What is it?" Maria asked, settling into her favorite chair in her small apartment. "There's a motorcycle safety conference next month, and they've asked me to be one of the keynote speakers. I'm supposed to tell my story, talk about the accident and how it changed my life." He paused. "They also want me to talk about the rescue, about how strangers came together to save my life. I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to appear with me, to tell your side of the story." Maria was quiet for a long moment, considering the request. The thought of speaking publicly about the accident was daunting, but she could see the value in sharing their story with other motorcyclists who might benefit from hearing about the real consequences of reckless riding. "What would you want me to talk about?" she asked. Whatever you're comfortable sharing, Jake replied. Maybe about what went through your mind when you decided to help instead of just waiting for the paramedics. Maybe about how you organized the other people at the scene. The conference organizers think it would be powerful for people to hear from both of us. Maria thought about all the progress Jake had made since the accident. His transformation from an angry, reckless rider to an advocate for safety was genuinely remarkable. If sharing their story could prevent even one similar accident, it would be worth the discomfort of speaking publicly about such a personal experience. Okay, she said, I'll do it. The conference was held at a large hotel convention center with several hundred motorcycle enthusiasts in attendance. Maria had never spoken to such a large group before, and she felt nervous as she and Jake waited backstage for their introduction. Jake looked professional and confident in his wheelchair, wearing a suit and tie for the presentation. He had become quite skilled at public speaking over the past few months, and his nervousness seemed to be focused more on how Maria would be received than on his own performance. Are you ready for this? He asked her as they heard their names being announced. As ready as I'll ever be, Maria replied. They appeared on stage together, Jake rolling his wheelchair up a specially installed ramp, and Maria walking beside him. The audience was quiet and attentive as Jake began telling his story. He spoke honestly about the anger and frustration that had led to his reckless riding that day. He described the accident from his perspective, the terror of being trapped beneath his motorcycle, and the long journey of physical and emotional recovery that followed. Then he introduced Maria, and she told her version of events. She talked about the split-second decision to help organize Jake's rescue despite her own injuries and her anger about the accident. She explained how she had seen past her own pain to recognize another human being in crisis. But what seemed to resonate most with the audience was her description of the community that had formed spontaneously around Jake's trapped form. Strangers had worked together, risking their own safety to save someone they had never met. It was, she said, an example of the best of human nature emerging in the worst of circumstances. The audience was completely silent during her presentation, and when she finished, the applause was long and heartfelt. During the question and answer period that followed, several audience members spoke about how the story had affected their own approach to riding and risk-taking. One older man stood up and said, I've been riding for 30 years and I've gotten careless about speed and traffic laws. Hearing both of your stories makes me realize how quickly everything can change. Thank you for having the courage to share this with us. After the presentation, Maria and Jake were approached by dozens of conference attendees who wanted to share their own stories or express appreciation for the message they had delivered. Several people mentioned that they planned to change their riding habits based on what they had heard. As the conference wound down, Maria and Jake found themselves sitting together in the hotel lobby, processing the experience they had just shared. I think we might have actually made a difference today, Jake said. I saw people really listening, really thinking about their own behavior. Maria nodded. It felt good to turn something terrible into something positive. Maybe that's the best we can do with what happened to us. They sat quietly for a few minutes, watching conference attendees say their goodbyes and head home to their various cities and states. Many of them would return to their motorcycles with a new appreciation for safety and a deeper understanding of how quickly poor decisions can change lives forever. I have something else I want to ask you, Jake said eventually. Another speaking engagement? Maria asked with a smile. No, something personal. Jake's expression grew serious. I've been thinking about this for months, and I need you to know how much you're